An interesting way to start our story of William Wordsworth's The Prelude is to think about this as a poem about home. So I've brought you here to the house I grew up in, because this is my home. It's a little bit less glamorous than William Wordsworth's. Despite the fact that he was born elsewhere, he spent his childhood growing up in the Lake District. His mother had died, and his father was largely absent at work. So for a period of time of about 3 years, he was placed with a foster family. And he would look back on this as being the time that he loved most in the world. In fact, as soon as he was able, he bought a home in the Lake District, specifically to move back there with his sister. You see, his sister was not only his best friend, but also his editor, his confidant, his inspiration to a certain extent. We can't really consider the story of the Prelude without her, and we can't really consider the Prelude without an idea of home. William Wordsworth came from a long tradition of nature poets. He wasn't an innovator by any means, but the thing he did to revolutionise English poetry was to use the words that normal people would use. He tried to write without artificial poetic rules. It's why a lot of his poetry is written in blank verse. But this is the twist. Because he was incredibly educated, what he thinks of as how normal people talk is actually still an incredibly intelligent way of talking. Wordsworth is a smart guy pretending to be a simple guy. It's these layers that make it such an interesting poem. In English class, teachers love to talk about purpose and audience, and I'm as guilty of it as anyone else. So we've got to think about what the purpose is of this poem. On one hand, it could be self-exploration. It could almost be therapeutic for William Wordsworth. On the other hand, it could be to teach and guide young people in the same way that nature was. Because we don't know when in this poem, when in Wordsworth's life this poem was written. He could be a father to young children, hoping to guide them through his own experience of nature. He could be an old man. And this is where it's interesting. By the end of Wordsworth's life, he was somewhat famous. People would come to the Lake District to see him. In fact, Percy Shelley did the exact thing, but when he turned up, Wordsworth wasn't home, so he came away empty-handed. He would guide people around his house, around the local village. He would sit down with people and share his views in this kind of old sage, Mr. Miyagi kind of model. Is that the character that's talking? Is he in wise old sage sharing the messages of my life mode? I've always felt it is. I've always felt it's a middle-aged man looking back on how he got to where he was. I mean, that's the beauty of poetry, right? I'm 32 and I'm coming at it from that perspective. But the idea of him as an old man, sitting down and giving his wisdom to these youngsters, is quite compelling. Think about a time that was really important to you. I'm still in my parents' garden, and there's a lot of specific childhood memories which I know were really important to me. If you can imagine that time, a specific incident that you felt so alive, it could be a party, a school play, anything, then you are experiencing a spot of time. That's what Wordsworth called these incidents, which later, looking back, were so important. The extract that's set in classrooms is actually only one part of a much, much longer poem. It's all called The Prelude. But there's several spots of time which are explored. The first one is seeing a dead body. But there's also ice skating and realising what his body could do. There's also stealing birds' eggs and once again feeling the power of nature as it tells him not to. These are the spots of time which he's exploring, these very pivotal points that he's highlighted as being incredibly important. Now, what's either amazing or terrible, depending on your view on Wordsworth, is that the Prelude was not intended to be a work on its own. Wordsworth was working on a larger poem called The Recluse, based on the poetry of John Milton. It would detail the fall of Adam and Eve and the rise and fall of human progress based on religion and science. The Prelude was intended to be the introduction, explaining why Wordsworth was qualified to write this. Unfortunately, The Recluse was never written, and it's one of these great mysteries of what could have been. Would it have been this poem which changed the entire game of poetry forever? Well, we're never going to know. It's a little bit too easy to say that nature is powerful in the poem. Well, yeah, it is true, but that's only like 1/3 of the story. Nature is an unknowable force. It's beyond what humans can comprehend. And the gift it gives us is imagination, is poetry. But like all great teachers, nature has to discipline as well as inspire. That's where and why nature scares Wordsworth in this poem. Nature is acting almost as his parent, and if we're being Freudian about this, we can say because his dad was largely absent from his childhood and his mother died very young, Wordsworth didn't have any parents in his life. He was largely left to sort of do his own thing. He had adult guardians, but they weren't really that involved. It was just him. Therefore, it doesn't take a huge psychological leap to have him place the natural world in the position of his parent. That's why nature guides him, but also stops him when he oversteps. This is a poem about home. Homes can change over time. I was in my parents' garden and I'll be there again in a moment, don't worry. But behind me is the Maritime Museum in Greenwich, which is my home now. So some people would have a conflict between the ideas of their homes. Luckily I don't, it's just one bus line between where I started this video and where I am now. And Wordsworth never really had a conflict about where his home was. But he did have a conflict about his politics. See, Wordsworth was always a revolutionary guy. He wanted change to happen, change to benefit the poor people around him. But he wanted that change to come from above. He believed that the power to change and the power to improve came from the gentry, came from the local nobility. Wordsworth was always skin. A lot of his poems had really, really bad reviews. So when, via a friend of his father, he was offered a job collecting what we'd now say was collecting taxes, but collecting the money from people who used the post office, it was a difficult decision. He faced a conflict between, do I take this job to provide for my sister, my children, my wife, my dependents, or do I stay true to my ideals? Wordsworth took the job, and in some ways I can respect that. He has to have food on the table in order to be able to do everything else. But it wouldn't have been a pleasant situation for him. Since we know he was writing the Prelude looking back from the past, looking back on the past from where he was, then is that the conflict that's bubbling around in his brain? Is that the thing that's bothering him? As I said, we can't date the Prelude exactly. So that could have been what was bothering him. To put the Prelude in its full context, we also need to consider a really important philosopher, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In his book Emile, which is a novel but it's a fictionalised account of what he believed, a young person is brought up purely by nature. They're allowed to express themselves naturally, they're allowed to surround themselves with nature's beauty. And that's what leads them to be the perfect adult, to become the adult that they should be. Wordsworth firmly believed that. In fact, when he later had his own children, that is exactly how he would bring them up. Is this incident recounted in the poem an example of Wordsworth putting his money where his mouth is and saying how Rousseau's theories actually created who he was? Nature's intervention in the poem is a very difficult, traumatic time for the young Wordsworth to understand. And it wouldn't be the only difficult time he'd face in his life. As I mentioned before, his parents were largely out of the picture when he was a child. So he not only had that trauma of separation, but also not really having the words or skills to deal with it. A Freudian approach to the poem is to see nature as taking the place of the parent, of being the one who guides him and then stops him when he gets too far. The other trauma that he would face was a little bit more political. You see, Wordsworth was a huge proponent of the French Revolution. To him it was amazing. All the ideas of liberty that he held within his heart were finally coming true. And he went to France. He fell in love with a French girl. They had a child together. But then things got a little bit too dangerous, a bit too hairy, and he had to head back home. It wasn't just the separation of his family that traumatised him. It was the fact that all the ideas of liberty, which he had by the year 1792, were replaced by the terror, or replaced by violence again. He had to deal with the loss of his philosophy, as well as the loss of his family. Remember, the Prelude is written from the perspective of an old man tracing his development as a poet. That old man could be portraying this incident as a way he learned how to deal with trauma. An old man who's experienced all these things, whose viewpoint is coloured by his full life's experiences, may well see this incident as being incredibly important. I'm finishing this story exactly where I began, in my parents' garden, because our life is full of the possibilities of what could have been. If there had been a tree over there, would I have fallen out of it and broken my arm? If there had been a conservatory, would I have used it to study in and studied harder? We'll never know. But the one thing we do know is that in this one specific spot of time, nature did impress her power on Wordsworth.